Those days I don't take any.
Oh,
I think
shoot.
that might be knacking me joints up. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Mm, right.
I'll
Okay.
keep an eye on it. I'll keep an eye on
Yes.
it.
Sounds like you're taking good care of yourself. I was worried.
Yeah.
Yeah. It took a long time for gravel to work itself out of my elbows. So, anyway, yeah, good.
The spill. Hmm.
Yeah. Took a spill.
Yeah, never heard that.
Okay, I'm going to start in a second here, folks.
Right. Enjoy.
Okay, it's distant data information. 3rd of March, how time flies. I'm going to talk about Marxist rent again, but with a few additions. And yes, I am sort of returning to something I talked about before. Maybe I'm a little better organized this time to talk about it, and it will seem repetitive. It actually is includes some new material. It includes some things that I muddled around with by the time we got to volume 3 of Capital, which no one paid attention to anyway. So, um, and this continues on with my little research program. It's always been about rent in the sense that it extends the idea about fictitious capital, and it is this thing that seems not to have labor equivalence, is function of a function of surplus value, um, uh, seems not to have that, as I said, that labor equivalence, which shouldn't, be a detriment in terms of analysis. People, unfortunately, because of that correlation issue, um, and people don't sort of understand that it's a dynamic model that sublates, as it were, that moves forward. Um, Transforms itself in a dialectic way, and you don't have to do all that Hegel stuff to necessarily get there. But you can see that it's dynamic. It's dynamic for very perhaps obvious reasons, but it does involve a lot more analysis. So um, I started with looking and returning to, and it's something I haven't fully covered before, but this is Dipankar Basu's Marxist Theory of Rent. I think a couple of years ago I talked about this. I also talked about his book, um, which isn't on rent. It's sort of a basic introduction to Marxist economic theory, but and it's a good book. But in this particular article, which is freely available up at UMass from UMass, is largely about ground rent, largely pointed towards agricultural issues. So he's obviously held some things constant. That is, that he's talking mainly about agricultural things, or that things that would are very basic in that particular sense, but they are applicable to a wide range of stuff, which I will read in a moment. But let me skip to the end here, and you can see that. Sorry, I have to scroll up here. I included David Harvey's commentary on rent as well at the end. It's from a thing that he did. I think it's a lecture session of some kind, where he talks about the return of the rentier, and it doesn't have any math. It is a kind of reflection, though, on the issue of what rentiers are, and as we saw with Michael Hudson's work on financialization, that the rentier is a pretty important person these days, in the sense that that's where all the action is, whether it's making money from crypto, or buying crap up, or you know doing little side stuff with stocks and bonds, the rentier is a fairly important character. And yes, while it's not directly exploiting labor, labor will eventually get exploited. This is the whole point, is that far too many people particularize the argument. You say, well, if you're worried about all this financialization stuff, it doesn't mean anything. It's like a casino on the one hand. On the other hand, uh, some people throw away their entire incomes at this kind of activity. So you need to sort of work through what that means, considering, of course, that in the current economic situation, there are people being disemployed, as I have referred to previously. It's not being underemployed, it's being disemployed, and that's kind of what's going on at the present moment. So in that sense, I included the piece by David Harvey. I include Ed George's notes from chapter 37 of volume 3. I know that may seem a little too obscure, but it is about surplus profit and ground rent, which I think is useful as a background, and we'll get there eventually. Not while I'm yakking, but Andy Higginbottom is probably going to do a series, his usual 15-week or so series that we did with volume 1 of Capital, volume 2 of Capital, and now probably in the fall, volume 3. So there'll be an entire little lecture series for that over at the CSSGJ website. And looking forward to that, just simply because he's going to extend the basic model that he used for volumes 1 and 2. So that will be useful. I'd love to hear him talk about that. So in that sense, I also included, which I hadn't included before, a little slide set from another place that is a discussion of reviews, the theory of rent from a classical and a Marxist approach. So it's got standard PowerPoint slides. And I may start there and then talk about the variations. That is, that Ed George is talking specifically about chapter 37, which is Marx really drilling down to the ground rent issue, and David Harvey talking about the rentiers, and then Basu talking about agricultural rent. And all these things fit together because the three basic ideas that we get from both classical and Marxist, it's all classical ultimately, and that is the idea of differential rents and absolute rent, some of which you have to sort of set aside when you're sort of looking at certain specific sectors like agriculture or other kinds of things. And at some bright and shining moment, you actually have to put them all together. And that's the important point, is to be able to say, okay, at this level or layer of the economy, you have to see where the intersection, the thing that drills down all the way through various different layers of the economy. So there's ground rent, there's the rent on things that are above the ground that you build above the ground. And then you look at how that becomes commodified as well. And of course, financialized in that same sense that people own, floors of mixed use buildings, for investment's sake. They don't actually live in the damn things. They just either rent it out to other people, which is handled, of course, by the people who are in charge of the building. Um, and of course, there's other elements that are part of the issue, homeowners association, blah, 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 blah. In each instance, there are additional costs and fees. The the same kinds of things that we were talking about yesterday, sort of false costs that I mentioned yesterday. And while they're false, or if you want to think of a cost as capital in that particular sense, and that may be taking it too far, but as a item, an accounting item, you want to sort of think about what is that role in the larger picture, and that it represents a certain kind of way in which you think and plan about how to do stuff. So anyway, without burdening you with too much detail, let's see if we can read this. Conclusion, both Ricardo and Marx talk about the tussle and antagonism between the landed property holder and the industrial capitalist. The difference lies in the way of analysis, where Ricardo advocates the capitalist class, where accumulation of capital can be focused on upon bringing prosperity in the economy. Marx, on the other hand, sees this process from the conflict perspective. For Marx, the landlords, in a way, support the existence of capitalists as they are class that are known for exploitation. Unlike Ricardo here, the capitalists and the landlords are not antagonistic, rather fuel the same purpose. And the point of even yakking about this and even doing all these diagrams and stuff is to show the differences among questions of when you can or can't deal with rent on land. And of course, the idea is that there exists, particularly in a multiply divided plot of land, marginal differences among plots of land. And therefore, there is a ratio of proportion. There is, in terms of figuring it out, there are differential things that are associated, differential rents that can be associated with each of these different types of things. And of course, the point is to look at issues of fertility, which are, sort of within the land, and then capital improvements, which are placed upon the land. And of course, obviously, if you apply fertilizer to the land, et cetera, to change its fertility, that's a kind of technology, and it's a definitional issue for some people because, it's not, well, it's the difference between organic and inorganic farming, I suppose, the difference between trying to use more natural materials and less natural or more artificial materials in order to transform. And both are technologies. One is just simply more organic or whatever, which is the issue. And of course, there's a price difference. Obviously, you can see that as a consumer, the difference you pay between organic and less organic or non-organic stuff. And then there's, of course, all the other variations, including, genetically engineered stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So the point being, of course, is that when we get back down to the land, there are differences, and we need to try and measure those differences because they have implications, as I think you can see in this diagram, to what goes on in terms of demand in the market. And the issue, of course, for Marx and for critics of Marx, like in Volume 1, is, Marx doesn't talk a lot about the market. I mean, the market in the sense of, demand in a big picture. He tries to leave that for volumes 2 and 3. So, many people criticize Marx on saying, well, he didn't blah, 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 talk about this and that and the other thing. Well, he was going to talk about them. And eventually he did talk about some of them, but he didn't talk about everything. And that's kind of, not that we're trying to fill in all the blanks, but rather trying to say, generally, it's still an important idea that, labor's involved somewhere. Its relationship is complicated because it's complicated by a system of commodities, money, commodities, and then ultimately wages, and et cetera, et cetera. And then ultimately it's the bigger picture of what counts as capital, that is the abstraction that sort of integrates all of these matters. And noting, of course, that rent is an extreme version of that in the sense that it's hard to find, you can't sort of work it out that it has labor equivalence in that particular way. So does that contradict a labor theory of value? No, it really doesn't. We're looking at different levels of capital, different moments in the circuit, and they do overlap at certain moments, but they're not identical. And I think that you always need to think about the sort of multiple levels of this. And I like to think that when you look at the earlier, if you try and use a Ricardian model, as I show here, then this one is designed under scarcity. You can see all the different levels. So here's an example that I think will get, this is more of a discussion about bid rent. And if you will recall, several years ago, I talked about bid rent, that is the distance. Once you start figuring these differential uses, you start measuring or trying to estimate rents as a function of the distance from the center of the central business district, which is a very simplistic model over, it assumes that the world is always concentric circles from a center, and they aren't. Every city has a center, sort of, and you might even have a town square and blah, 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 a civic center in that sense. But the reality is that they don't necessarily, it's not even, and it's always uneven, pretty much, unless you have a brand new perfect city of that the neoliberals would like to have, and which would be a perfect experiment in one sense if you made it perfectly circular. You could actually do it, compute it all that way. But the reality is that it's not. Usually you have topography, terrain gets in the way. So anyway, increasing distance, decreasing accessibility, and that's another issue as well from the urban core. And so here you see different versions of utility, right? Social utility, which we've seen argued, of course, with Marx about, what counts as utility is a perfectly reasonable concept to have. It's just that it's hard to commodify, and some people often refer to it in that kind of way, which is a kind of neoclassical way of thinking about it, or a Marshallian point of view. So the point is, of course, that you have differential uses here, right? Commercial land use, intermixture of commercial and residential uses. And of course, when does that occur? You have all kinds of different ways an urban fabric is constituted. But you do have residential land use, and that becomes more regularized, right? Suburbs are kind of like that. They, so sprawl and, moves towards the exurban, which is another kind of question as well. And you can see this intermixture of residential and agricultural uses and agricultural land use. So you have a multiple set of points or intersections among a variety of accessibilities and ways in which you define, the relation between utility and distance. It's very standard literature for it, or, well, not so much standard, but it's one that has become a de facto standard, which is problematic for a whole bunch of other reasons. But it is important to think in these ways because for a lot of people, that's kind of the way you need to think about it. That is density, population density, the kind of way in which you think concentration and access, and and periodically there's new little ideas that people come up with, like the 15-minute city, et cetera, which are very problematic and has all of its own issues, that doesn't attend to people with disabilities very well, and there's all kinds of other issues. Aside from the cultural elements, right? The racial, redlining, blah, blah, blah. There's all that as well. So that's important to consider. And the transformation of surplus profit into ground rent, chapter 37. This is at George's notes, and he talks about it because he had trouble figuring this out. And I've read this before, now several years ago, in June of 1862, in a letter to Engels, and after complaining bitterly at his family's parlous economic state, Marx commented thus: "I've at last been able to sort out this ground rent shit, Grundrent Schisse." And I had long harbored misgivings as to the absolute correctness of Ricardo's theory, and have at length got to the bottom of the swindle. So it is. These are preliminary issues, and this is not the complete presentation on ground rent. There's a lot more, but one needs to sort of think about what that means. And it did have a big influence, although not fully fleshed out in a different way by David Harvey. Marx sets out at the beginning that here he is interested in analysis of landed property only insofar as it is dominated by the capitalist mode of production. That means we're dealing with the conditions in which rural production is pursued by capitalists who are distinguished from other capitalists simply by the element in which their capital and the wage labor that it sets in motion are invested. In addition, we are also assuming that capitalist production dominates production in general, and also that there exists, number one, the free competition of capitals. Number two, the free transferability of capital from one sector to another. And number three, an equalized average rate of profit. Now remember, this equalized average rate of profit has been an issue since volume one. Is it measurable? Is it, and you, in the back of your head, you say, well, why is it necessary? There's always going to be an average. So, why is that, essential? And of course, you can tie yourself up in knots about the necessity to talk about that in terms of the concept of a rate of profit from which you would, generate interest rates and et cetera, and from which you could say that this is a market price or something, whatever. Uh, Once you can get too tied up in that, the other more problematic element is there's no perfect free competition of capitals, and there is no free transferability of capital from one sector to another. There's always going to be friction, and there's always friction. You can't. It's just like physics, you're not going to, it's not going to be perfect. There's no vacuum in which this can be perfect. Um, so under these assumptions, the three classes that make up the framework of modern society confront each other in agricultural production, which is what Basu was talking about. Direct cultivation is carried out by wage laborers as opposed to, feudal tenureship, et cetera, employed by the capitalist who pursues agriculture simply as a particular field of the exploitation of capital, and who in turn pays ground rent to the landowner, the proprietor of land. Now, automatically you go into your brain and say, well, landed capital or, the gentry, landowners are even more problematic in some ways since, they've held this land for hundreds or thousands of years. And it's an interesting legal notion, but that's another area. But it is problematic when you consider that, who was there first, and the fact that they kind of roamed on and didn't set up, uh, land holding courts. They've given up their right to the land. Well, it just depends on your view of the world, and it's very true that indigenous peoples do have a very different view of what counts as land or the terrestrial world. So there's a whole bunch of other issues that aren't really fully attended to. Capital fixed into the land. The capitalist farmer fixes capital into the land. The fixed capital may take the more transient form of improvements in fertility through, for example, the application of fertilizer, and more permanent form through an alteration in the land's physical nature. That is, drainage, irrigation, leveling, um, physical condition, construction in form of buildings, etc. These capital investments transform the earth from a mere raw material into earth-capital. But these improvements pass to the landowner once the contracted lease period expires. So in other words, you have a tenant, they, make improvements, and the issue is whether, the assessed value of this property is going to remain the same or different, or et cetera, with all these issues. When the new lease contract is realized, the landowner adds interest on the capital incorporated into the earth, and his rent increases. If she sells the land, its value is augmented. This is one of the secrets of the increasing enrichment of the landowners as economic development progresses. Of course, it seems pretty logical, even in a pre-industrial, pre-capitalist state. Somebody's built their castle on the damn land. The castle sort of is an improvement for the most part. I mean, they're hard to heat, but they do protect you if somebody tries to, conquer you. Marx now makes an interesting comment. In a given mode of production, the forms of property that exist within it find their existential justification insofar as they possess a transitory historical necessity. Landed property, however, is distinguished by the fact that at a certain level of development, it appears superfluous and harmful, even from the standpoint of the capitalist mode of production. This is my usual comment about, for example, Downton Abbey kind of represents that friction between the two things. The determination of the price of land. Land, even uncultivated land, is of course bought and sold, but what determines its price? How indeed, in the case of uncultivated land on which no labor has been expended and which, as a consequence, has no value, how can it even have a price? Is a result of the capitalization of its ground rent at the prevailing rate of interest. Capitalization, which we encountered in the previous section, is the process by which any given income may be conceived of as an interest payment arising from some imagined capital value that had been loaned out. So, for example, given a general prevailing per annum interest rate of 5%, a sum of value of £2,000 loaned out would realize an annual income, interest, of 100 pounds. By comparison, then, any income stream of 100 pounds may be imagined as the interest on a capital value of 2,000 pounds, whether or not this capital value exists. So what you have here is an indexical relation. This thing sort of exists, and it thereby sort of establishes a standard, as it were. And we know, of course, that that's just a contingent thing. But a financial asset on which an annual income stream of 100 pounds arises may thus be imagined to be worth 2,000 pounds, and in this way acquires a price. You see, there's a certain set of extrapolations that from which price is estimated. But we know, of course, this is highly variable and, it's negotiable in some ways, whatever. But this sort of slop in precision is exactly where all the value is, where the value gets either deflated or inflated. Marx calls this capitalization, the formation of fictitious capital. Though while it may indeed be fictitious, it is far from fictional. Now, I think that's really the important element that we always come from Marx. That is, his discussion of fictitious capital doesn't mean that it just, it's illusory or that it, epiphenomenal. It's there. For the buyer of the asset, the annual 100 pounds does actually represent the conversion of the capital he has invested. Nevertheless, that such a reverse assigning of a price to an income-generating asset as possible means that all connection with the actual process of capital's valorization is lost, confirming the notion that capital is automatically valorized by its own powers. So the point being, of course, that it becomes fictitious in the sense that, oh, well, how did you get those numbers? Well, it's just sort of always been that way. And this can be a little bit, Ed George, follows this logic a little further, about what counts as interest rates and prevailing interest rates. And I won't, bore you with the thing here, but it is identified by the problems of ground rent and lease price. And Marx distinguishes between ground rent proper on the one hand and lease price on the other. The latter is what the farmer actually pays to the landowner for the right to cultivate the land, and which, capitalized, determines the price of land. The lease price includes ground rent, but also includes foreign components. In addition to the interest on capital incorporated into the land, lease price, insofar as it's set artificially high, will include a deduction from average profit or from normal wages, or both. In the case of a deduction from profit, a part of the capitalist farmer's normal profit is paid to the landowner for the right to invest her capital in land. The capitalist farmer is compelled by circumstances to invest her capital in agricultural production, and this condition of compulsion may be exploited by the landowners. So, for example, the corn laws allowed landowners to charge increasingly higher lease prices with which higher grain prices could never keep up. And, this went on for a decade plus. The farmers were cheated in this way from 1815 to the 1830s. Now, just as the capitalist farmers compelled by the landowner's monopoly control over land to forego a part of average profit to be able to pay the lease price for her land, she too may be compelled to pay the agricultural proletarians she employs a wage below that normally prevailing. So Marx's conclusion on this is in considering the forms of appearance of ground rent, i.e. the lease price that is paid to the landowner under this heading for the use of the soil, whether for productive purposes or those of consumption, we must keep in mind, finally, that the price of things that have no value in and of themselves, either not being the product of labor, like land, or which at least cannot be reproduced by labor, such as antiques, works of art by certain masters, etc., may be determined by quite fortuitous combinations of circumstances. For a thing to be sold, it simply has to be capable of being monopolized and alienated. And, pretty much we've got a whole bunch of possibilities there. And you can see that there's tremendous abuse and whatever connivance going on. Marx concludes the chapter by identifying three errors. Really, it's the same error expressed in three different ways, which obscure the nature of ground rent and which need to be avoided in the analysis. Number one, an inability to see differences in the level of social development behind the common economic form of rent. That is, the appropriation of rent is the economic form in which landed property is realized, and the fact that this, the fact of landed property, the legal fiction by virtue of which various individuals have exclusive possession of particular parts of the globe, is common to all forms of rent, occludes the nature of the social development on which it is premised. Number two, all ground rent is surplus value, the product of surplus labor, but to explain the source of surplus labor does not explain the form in which a part of it manifests itself. This requires a specific analysis. And number three, what determines the level of ground rent is not the activity of the landowner, but rather the course of social development. The development of commodity production increases the demand for foodstuffs and, importantly, for raw materials in function of the relative growth of the non-agricultural population compared to the agricultural. But product of social labor can only appear as a commodity insofar as there are other commodities external to it, that is, other products of social labor for which it may be exchanged. Rent appears as money rent only insofar as social production takes the form of commodity production, and there appears the development of a non-agricultural population, people in the cities, as independent of the agricultural. Thus, even though rent appears as the ability of the landed population to appropriate a part of the surplus labor to themselves through their monopoly control of the land, ultimately, it is the capitalist to whom falls the active role in the creation of surplus value. Thus, the analysis of capitalist ground rent presupposes a prior analysis of commodity production. So what Marx is trying to force forward is that, we can't say that, you can't keep holding on to certain historical notions about what the land is supposed to be when in fact the historical moment is different. And so you have to sort of see it in this larger context, which is, of course, problematic for all of its own kind of reasons. So in that sense, we go all the way back up here and consider Basu's approach to this, which is mainly agricultural, but it still explicates, I think, in a reasonable way, why we get to something called rentiers. That is, people who, are seen as making financialize the sort of object. So Basu says, this paper offers an analytic treatment of a Marxist theory of rent. I highlight the key role played by the price of the agricultural commodity in determining rent. So this is different than what Marx is talking about in chapter 37, volume 3, because Marx is already saying, well, there's other things aside from the agricultural commodity, and you need to sort of think about that. So we try to ignore that. He's trying to just sort of look at this in a very micro sort of sense. I offer two closures of the model. The first closure is an elaboration of Marx's argument in volume 3 of Capital, which does not have any role for demand. This is that demand thing I was just talking about before, where you look at differential rents and their relationship to why there is demand for stuff. And of course, is a big question in volume 1 for a lot of people to say, well, Marx didn't have any, didn't account enough for demand. He just didn't get there, that's all. The second closure extends Marx's analysis by explicitly allowing for the role of demand. I also show that total rent can be decomposed into 3 components, and these are the standard ones built on Ricardo's model: absolute rent, differential rent 1, and differential rent 2. I emphasize that a Marxist theory can explain rent in any system of capitalist commodity production which uses privately owned, non-reproducible resources. So that's a very specific condition. Artwork is non-reproducible, at least at one level of the model, even though obviously with a Xerox machine, whatever, etc. Hence, it is applicable far beyond the domain of agriculture and can be used for an analysis of rent in other sectors like, among others, oil and natural gas, mining, real estate. So, Marx's analysis of the distribution of surplus value in volume 3 proceeds in 2 analytically separate steps. In the first step, the total surplus value generated in production is distributed across different sectors through the competition between industrial capitals. Competition is manifested in the mobility of capital across sectors in search of higher rates of profit. The long-run equilibrium of this competitive process is the emergence of an average rate of profit across all sectors, supported by prices of production, which necessarily implies a redistribution of the different magnitudes of surplus value generated across sectors due to the differences in organic compositions of capital. That is, there's just different technologies, et cetera, and surplus value must therefore be somewhat variegated. In the second step, some of the surplus value appropriated by industrial capital is further redistributed to other fractions of the ruling class as commercial profit, ground rent, and interest. While Marx is clear that ground rent could arise in any sector that used natural resources for commodity production, he offered most of his analyses in terms of the specifics of agricultural production. Now, that's just, this is the 19th century. You have very specific things that are, you have mining, fishing, growing stuff, raising horses, cutting trees, etc. The emergence of ground rent in agriculture requires, according to Marx, two conditions: a lower than average organic composition of capital in agriculture, and the presence of landed property, where with landed property comes the monopoly of use of the land. Good fences, establish my stuff. Landed property presupposes that certain persons enjoy the monopoly of disposing of certain portions of the globe as exclusive spheres of their private will to the exclusion of others. That's why rich people want islands, right? The first condition, lower than average organic composition of capital in agriculture, gives rise to higher than the economy-wide average rate of profit. Marx refers to this as surplus profit. The second condition, that is the presence of landed property, erects what Marx calls an absolute barrier to the mobility of capital. The impediment to this free movement of capital into agriculture has two effects. It prevents the surplus profit from flowing away to the realization of surplus value in Volume 2. Marx takes up the analysis of distribution of surplus value in Volume 3 of Capital. I think I skipped something here. Yes, from agriculture as would a cap. If there no, this is because I copied one thing wrong. There are no barriers to the mobility of capital into agriculture, and equally important, it allows the surplus value to be appropriated by the class of landowners, i.e., the owners of the land. It's land rent. Marx's theory of ground rent outlined above raises two questions. The first question relates to the domain of the applicability of the theory. In Marx's theory of ground rent, Marx's theory of ground rent applicable beyond agriculture? And the answer is in the affirmative, as Marx himself emphasized. The theory of ground rent can be applied to any sector of capitalist commodity production which uses a non-reproducible natural resource that is privately owned. Hence, the analysis can be applied to other sectors like mining, oil and natural gas, real estate, tourism. But this immediately raises the second question. How important is the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital? If the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital is crucial for the logic of the emergence of ground rent, then it is doubtful if Marx's theory can be applied to any sector at all. Not only is mining, oil and natural gas, and real estate as capital intensive as the rest of the economy, it's no longer possible to assert that even agriculture is less capital intensive than the rest of the economy, other than in some developing countries. The main contribution of this paper is to develop a consistent, unified Marxist theory of rent. In developing this theory, I will use the term land for any non-reproducible natural resource that is privately owned and that can be used in the production of commodities. I will use the term agriculture to refer to the economic activity of producing some commodity on the land, and I will use the term agricultural commodity to refer to the commodity that is produced on the land. After setting up the basic model, I will highlight the key role played by the price of the agricultural commodity for the theory of rent. I'll offer two closures of the model. The first closure is a development of Marx's argument in Volume 3 of capital relies on the juxtaposition of lower than average organic composition of capital and barriers to mobility of capital to explain rent. In developing this closure, I show that there is one significant way in which Marx's account needs to be amended. Just lower than average organic composition of capital is not sufficient for generating rent. A stronger concavity condition, the concavity is defining the shape of the curve, a concavity condition about the lower organic composition of capital in agriculture is needed. The second closure extends Marx's analysis in several significant ways. First, unlike the analysis in Volume 3 of Capital, this closure allows for a direct role of demand. Hence, unlike Marx's analysis and the contemporary neo-Ricardian analysis, where the output of the agricultural commodity is taken as given, I allow, that is, Basu allows, for the joint determination of the output and price of the agricultural commodity. The latter, in turn, determining the magnitude of rent. Second, it moves away from the analysis of Volume 3 by dispensing with the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital. This is very important because it now increases the applicability of this Marxist theory of rent to a wide range of contemporary contexts, where the assumption of lower than average organic composition of capital can no longer be justified. Things aren't as primitive, let's put it that way. In developing the Marxist theory of rent, this paper connects with several strands of extant literature, and then, Eaton, Mendel, Fine, Rubin, Ghosh, Foley, Howard and King, Samuelson, Ramirez, blah, 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 blah. The main contribution of this paper with respect to the existing Marxist literature is that I formalize the theory of rent. Marx used a series of often confusing examples in Volume 3 of Capital to illustrate his arguments. Later authors followed him in presenting arguments mostly with the help of examples. Specific examples are driven by specific assumptions. And so it's not possible to understand the general logic of the argument with the help of examples only. A formal mathematical framework, on the other hand, can help us grasp general arguments. Now, that's kind of the way he's going to approach this paper, and he spends a fair amount of about 10 or 15 pages of math to try and get this to work out. And it works out. It's fine. I think he has to make too many assumptions to get the math to work, but it works. Second, it indirectly speaks to the contemporary neo-Ricardian literature on rent. Within the classical condition, the theory of rent was elaborated most clearly by David Ricardo and further developed by Piero Sraffa. A clear formal treatment of the neo-Ricardian model theory of rent in a general n-sector economy, that is, n, whatever number n is, n-sector economy with linear technology, can be found in Kurtz and Salvadori, or whatever. The Marxist theory of rent that I develop in this paper, that Basu develops in the paper, differs from the neo-Ricardian literature on rent in several ways. While the neo-Ricardian analysis uses a general equilibrium framework, the Marxian theory developed in this paper is a partial equilibrium analysis. The shortcoming of the theory developed in this paper comes with certain advantages over the general equilibrium neo-Ricardian analysis. The neo-Ricardian analysis uses linear technology, but the Marxian theory allows for non-linear technologies. And this is a very important point. The neo-Ricardian analysis does not have any place for demand and conducts the whole analysis by taking the level of output of the agricultural commodity as given. In contrast, the Marxian theory developed in this paper allows for the role of demand in jointly determining output and price of the agricultural commodity. The latter, in turn, determining the magnitude of rent. So this is how you can sort of refine the price question. Finally, the neo-Ricardian analysis does not allow for the existence of absolute rent. The Marxian theory not only explains absolute rent, but accords it an important place in the whole analytic framework. Third, it connects to the emerging critical literature on land rent and urban housing. While the traditional understanding of high rent and prices of real estate in urban areas has often seen zoning regulation as a key causative factor, the emerging critical literature digs deeper into the reasons for limited supply and tries to identify different classes that benefit from the restricted supply. This paper offers a coherent theoretical framework that could inform discussions of land rent in critical urban studies. And this is the important part of what his math is useful for. Before we turn to the details of the analysis of rent, it's important to remember that its existence highlights for Marx just another aspect of the irrationality of capitalism. For rent derives from proprietary rights over parts of the earth and its natural resources, a fact as absurd as the ownership of one human being by other human beings. The analysis of rent is therefore, at one and the same time, an indictment of the absurdity of capitalist social relations. See, ultimately, there is a point to doing all of this. The rest of the paper is organized as follows. Section 2, introduce the basic setup. Section 3, surplus profit and rent. Discuss the three components of rent and highlight the key conditions for the existence of rent. In Section 4, Basso develops the first closure of the model of rent, which is an elaboration of the argument of Marx in Volume 3 of Capital. In Section 5, develops the second closure of the model that extends Marx's analysis by explicitly incorporating the role of demand and profit maximizing behavior of capitalist farmers. I conclude the discussion in Section 6 with some caveats and ideas about extensions. And I'm going to skip ahead because there's a lot of math in there. And essentially, it boils down to showing that there is some proportional relationship between the size or magnitude of surpluses that signify these rent differences. So there is some comparative statics allows us to sort of look at the comparisons, but not to overgeneralize from it. In other words, you can see the little model there, and you can see all the curves and all the little sectors and stuff. But the reality is, of course, it doesn't sit like that in reality. You have to sort of, it can't be static. It's got to be a dynamic set of relations so that you get the sort of basic front end. The problem, or as he identifies here, is the problem of the magnitude of rent. So, there are issues of technology, et cetera. And depending on the elasticity of the supply curve, this can lead either to a rise or fall in the magnitude of rent. More inelastic the demand, higher is the possibility of a fall in the rent. It's all mathematically okay. So let me get to his conclusion and then I'll stop because we're running out of time. In this paper, Basso has developed a Marxist theory of rent. In developing this theory, he's used the term land for any non-reproducible natural resource that is privately owned and that can be used in the production of commodities. Basso uses the term agriculture to refer to the economic activity of producing some commodity on the land. And he's used the term agricultural commodity to refer to the commodity that is produced on the land. An immediate implication is that the Marxist theory of rent developed in this paper is applicable far beyond agriculture proper. It can be applied to any situation where privately owned, scarce, non-reproducible resource can be used in capitalist commodity production. For instance, in sectors like mining, oil and natural gas, real estate, and even tourism. In such situations, owners of the resource can bargain away a fragment of the surplus value or national income over and above wages generated in capitalist commodity production. This fragment of surplus value is what classical economists like Ricardo and Marx called rent, being a part of the surplus value generated in production and appropriated by owners of natural resources. Rent is an income stream earned without any expenditure of labor. This is what I said before about, sort of not associated with labor, and yet still it's part of the entire combination of discussing, sort of a whole theory of an economy, and one that does still, obviously imply capital. In this paper, I've demonstrated that the total rent can be decomposed into two components, differential rent and absolute rent. Differential rent, in turn, can be decomposed into differential rent of the first variety, which arises from differences in the quality of plots of land, and differential rent of the second variety, differential rent 2, which arises from the differences in the magnitude of capital investment on different plots of land. Absolute rent, on the other hand, arises from the ability of the class of landowners to prevent even the worst quality of land being given gratis for agricultural production. After highlighting the key role played by the price of the agricultural commodity in determining the magnitude of rent, I offered two closures of the model. In the first closure, the price of the commodity is determined by the principle of zero net flow of surplus value from agriculture, an argument pursued by Marx in Volume 3 of Capital. If the organic composition of capital is sufficiently lower than the economy-wide average, this principle of price determination can ensure positive rent on all plots of land. In the second closure, Basu allows for the explicit role of demand in determining both the output and the price of the agricultural commodity. In the second closure, we can dispense with the requirement of a lower than average organic composition of capital. Hence, this increases the applicability of the Marxist theory of rent to sectors beyond agriculture and to contemporary times as well. So, in effect, the second closure gives us a better handle on certain ideas that, in terms of rent differentials. In this paper, I have worked with a case where agricultural producers are price takers. This can be easily amended to take account of market power and price-making behavior. If the market for the agricultural commodity is dominated by a few firms, then the market price will be higher than the competitive price that I've used in Section 5. This will imply that the rent on each plot of land, including the worst plot, will be higher. Hence, in terms of the threefold decomposition of total rent that Marx discussed, price-making behavior in the market for the agricultural commodity will lead to higher absolute rent. All the qualitative features of the analysis will remain unchanged. I would like to end the paper, Basu ends the paper with two caveats. First, he's abstracted from technological change. Hence, the analysis in this paper is static and only investigates the question of the distribution of given magnitude of surplus value between capitalists and owners of natural resources. So to make the analysis more realistic, one will have to incorporate technological change into the framework. Second, the analysis is partial equilibrium in orientation. It takes the average rate of profit outside agricultural production as given and investigates the issues of production and distribution of surplus value within agriculture. To make the analysis more robust, it will be necessary to extend it to a general equilibrium setting where the average rate of profit and rent is jointly determined by demand and technology. So in this sense, he's tried to build the model without including actually two very critical elements, but it's, baby steps, right? You sort of have to go, okay, so this is kind of what it looks like. And we can scale this up once we start thinking about this in a more dynamic framework and with the addition of technology. So that's kind of what the paper is about. There's a lot of math in it. It tries to identify in a slightly different way the question of how we estimate differentials or the differences among types of rent. Like there's a difference between I don't have the one in front of me. There's a difference between these two little boxes, these boxes here in terms of ground rent versus adjusted ground rent. But anyway, it's there. It looks okay in when you draw it up. It looks fine. So take my word for it. Okay, so I got to the end of all of this. And but I didn't read the little section here, which we can read tomorrow or at some other time about rentiers, which I think raises a class question that probably still needs to be articulated. Not that it's a rigorous or it's not the same as running into the street and complaining about billionaires, although, it's essentially the same argument. And so from a political or a activist position, you sort of need to be able to say, well, what is this person doing? What's the role in the economy? And so even if, Warren Buffett gives, has just sent, I think, $500 million to Ukraine, he's still a rentier. So, I mean, I appreciate the fact that he did it and that, it might do some good in a humanitarian way, but he's still a rentier. you know, um, and not unlike any of the other billionaires we complain about. So I think that's important to remember that there is uh, no one likes to oversimplify to a rentier class, but it's pretty clear that there are rentiers, and they don't all have the same. Uh, they don't all look the same. There are classes of people, and they're not the other features, whether it's ethnicity or some other kind of thing. It's a much more heterogeneous a bunch of folks. So that question of a kind of class organization or class conflict or struggle is made a little more complicated. And I think that that's explicated in people like Michael Hudson talking about the difference or the differences among the problem of financiers and financialization, which is not a small thing. It really did create a recession, and we're at the a particular moment after certain attempts to try and destroy certain sectors of the economy that we will probably be in a recession in the next 6 months or so. It's just looking that way. So yesterday's report from the Atlanta Fed shows that GDP growth is in the negative, is predicted to be in the negative. And um, Donald Trump is tanking the economy. Trump and Musk are tanking the economy, just as the Democrats predicted. So anyway, I've got to the end of my time, and let me see if there's comments in the chat. Um, oh yes, tourism. Even taking photos with traditionally garbed people for tips is sort of a rent. Yes, absolutely, it is. It's rent seeking. My favorite is what is it? Donkey. They paint up donkeys to look like zebras, I think, in Tijuana. I don't know. This is a long time ago, but I think they still do it. Um, Space and cloud rent is the basis for techno-feudalism. Yes, indeed. That is yes, and so yes, those are all there. All righty then. I will stop the share and